They told me I had no claim. Not a cent, not a keepsake, not even a chair to sit on during the will reading. I stood there, listening to lawyers recite a legacy that erased me like I never mattered, like I was just a ghost haunting the edge of someone else's family portrait. My stepsiblings smirked. The judge barely looked at me. They'd already divided the estate in their minds, counted their millions, planned their renovations. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had something they didn't. A memory, one conversation, quiet and strange, tucked in the back of my mind. A whisper from Eleanor, my late stepmother: when the time comes, trust the drawer with no handle. It made no sense then. It means everything now. Because inside that hidden drawer was a single clause, a secret line in a secret document. And when I read it aloud in court, the entire room went silent. Even the judge looked stunned. And that's when everything changed. My name is Maya. And for most of my life, I've been the one on the sidelines, not unloved exactly, just unnoticed, quiet, easy to overlook. My mom passed away when I was 9. A few years later, my dad remarried a woman named Eleanor. She was elegant, well-spoken, and always a little mysterious. Her family was old money, private schools, wine estates, afternoon tea in real china. She had 2 children from a previous marriage, Sebastian and Claire. They were everything I wasn't: bold, polished, born into wealth. When they looked at me, it was like I didn't belong in the frame. But Eleanor, she never treated me like that. She wasn't warm, not in the traditional sense, but she was kind in the ways that mattered. She gave me books when I couldn't sleep, let me sit beside her in silence when the world felt too loud. And every now and then, she'd say something cryptic like a puzzle she wanted me to solve. Family isn't always about blood, she said once, while carefully tending her rose garden. I didn't understand it then. I do now. We weren't close in the way people expect family to be, but we shared a quiet understanding. And over time, that meant more to me than forced affection. When Eleanor passed, I didn't expect anything, not really. I showed up to the reading of the will more out of respect than hope. I thought maybe she'd left me a letter, a locket, something small. Instead, I was told I had no claim. Not to her house, not to her vineyard, not even to her memory. Her lawyers made it sound final, cold, dismissive. But I knew Eleanor, and something about it didn't sit right. Because even in silence, she always had a way of making herself heard. I just had to start listening in the right places. The day after the will reading, I sat alone in my car for over an hour, just staring at the dashboard. I kept thinking, this can't be it. It wasn't about the money. I'd lived with little my whole life, but the way they dismissed me, the way they erased any trace of my connection to Eleanor. It burned. I wasn't even mentioned. Not a thank you, not a goodbye, not even a token gesture. It felt like being buried alive in someone else's story. I went back to Eleanor's estate, not to fight but to remember. To walk through the rooms we once shared in silence, to feel something other than shame. The house was quiet. Everything had already been cataloged, boxed, prepared for auction. But I still had the key, and I still had the memory. Something Eleanor once told me during one of her cryptic chats in the library. She said, there's a drawer with no handle. You'll find it when you stop looking so hard. Back then, I thought she was being poetic. But that day, I found myself standing in front of her writing desk. It was carved oak, old as time, with dozens of compartments and little brass knobs. I ran my fingers along the edges, and then I felt it a ridge in the wood just beneath the surface panel. I pressed lightly, and with a soft click, a hidden drawer popped open. Inside was a leather folder, aged and worn, sealed with a deep green ribbon. My heart was pounding. I opened it carefully. Inside was a draft of a will unsigned, but it told a completely different story than the one read in court. This version named me as the sole heir to Eleanor's private vineyard. It included a passage in her own handwriting. To Maya, who sees what others overlook, you understand care, not just ownership. I stood there, shaking, tears running down my face, not out of greed, but because it meant she had seen me. She had remembered me. She had left something that mattered. But the lawyer had said that an unsigned will is meaningless. So I started digging through boxes of Eleanor's personal letters, through old contacts, notebooks, Journals. It wasn't just grief pushing me forward, it was instinct. I could feel she had left a trail, something unfinished, something hidden. And that's when I remembered the name of a man she used to meet with quietly, away from the family lawyers, a private legal advisor. She once called him the only person I trust with the truth. Finding him wouldn't be easy, but I had nothing left to lose, and I was finally ready to stop being invisible. Because whatever Eleanor was trying to tell me, I was going to hear it, all the way through. His name was Vincent Hale. An old school, no-nonsense attorney who lived 3 towns over. I found his name scribbled in the corner of one of Eleanor's journals, next to a quote, "Truth has no deadline." I didn't know what I'd find when I knocked on his office door. Part of me expected a rejection or worse, nothing at all. But when I mentioned Eleanor's name, everything changed. He paused, sat up straighter, looked at me like he already knew why I was there. "You're Maya," he said quietly. I nodded. He walked into the back room, without saying another word, and returned with a sealed envelope, thick, heavy. "My instructions were clear," he said. "Give this to you, only if things turned ugly." I took the envelope with both hands, my fingers trembling. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. When I got home, I didn't open it right away. I sat with it, because I knew once I looked inside, everything would change. Finally, I broke the wax seal. Inside, I found a notarized amendment to Eleanor's original will, a single page. But that page carried the weight of a lifetime. The clause was specific and brutal in its elegance. It stated that if her biological children ever attempted to exclude or diminish my role in her life, they would be immediately disinherited. No appeals, no exceptions. The vineyard. She left it to me explicitly. She even described it as a sanctuary for the overlooked. The clause ended with a handwritten line, "For Maya," who listened even when I had no words. It was real, signed, stamped, witnessed. It was everything. But getting the court to accept it wouldn't be that simple. I brought it to my own attorney, and he immediately warned me, "This changes the game. But prepare for war." He was right. Sebastian and Claire were livid. Their lawyers called the codicil a fabrication. They said Eleanor had been confused in her final months. They accused me of manipulation, fraud, desperation. The whispers began to spread. Family friends started pulling away. I even received a call from an old colleague who asked if what they were saying about me was true. It was humiliating, but I didn't back down, because I knew Eleanor. I knew what that vineyard meant to her, and more than that, I knew she had trusted me with the truth when no one else even thought I deserved a place at the table. I wasn't going to let that be erased, not this time. The first court hearing felt like walking into a lion's den. Sebastian and Claire sat across the room, dressed in designer black, looking as if they were already in mourning, not for Eleanor, but for their lost control. Their lawyer was sharp-tongued and smug. Mine was calm but cautious. The judge looked over the documents slowly. Slowly. It felt like hours passed as he turned each page, his expression unreadable. Then he set them down and said he would allow a handwriting expert to weigh in. That was my opening. I needed the truth to speak louder than their power. The analysis came back 2 weeks later. Eleanor's signature on the codicil, authentic. The document, legally binding. The only condition was whether she had been of sound mind when signing it. So I went back to Vincent Hale, and that's when he said something I'll never forget. She knew they would try to erase you, Maya. She planned for it. He handed me one final piece, a recorded video timestamped, dated, and sealed. Eleanor herself, speaking directly to the camera. She looked thinner in the video, but her voice was steady. She stared into the lens and said, "To the court, and to whoever fights this, I am of sound mind. My name is Eleanor Granger, and I am making this final amendment without coercion. If you're watching this, it means my children did exactly what I feared. They shut Maya out." I froze, even through the screen. Her voice carried the same quiet force she always had. She went on, "Maya has never asked for anything. She has been more family to me than anyone else. I am not leaving her scraps. I am honoring what she's earned with dignity, presence, and love. If they fight her, they lose everything. That's not punishment. That's accountability." My lawyer submitted the video into evidence. Sebastian turned red. Claire stood up and stormed out of the courtroom. And the judge, he leaned back, folded his hands, and said, "This case just took a very different turn." In that moment, everything I'd been carrying, the humiliation, the doubt, the fear, it began to crack open, not because I was winning, but because someone had finally said the truth out loud. Eleanor hadn't forgotten me. She'd protected me in the only way she could, by writing a truth that no one could deny. And now, for the first time, they were going to have to listen. The court wasn't quiet anymore. Now, it was electric. The air was heavy with tension, and every glance held weight. Reporters started showing up. People who once ignored me now whispered my name in courthouse hallways. But it wasn't admiration I felt. It was pressure. Because for every step forward, the fight got uglier. Sebastian and Claire didn't back down. They doubled their legal team, started spinning stories to the press saying I manipulated Eleanor in her final days, that I had inserted myself into the family just to get a piece of the estate. They brought up old photos where I stood in the background, as if that somehow proved I didn't belong. They even dredged up my financial records, pointed out my freelance work, my debt, tried to paint me as a woman desperate for a payday. And I'll be honest, there were nights I almost believed them. Nights I sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by legal folders and court transcripts, wondering if maybe I should just walk away. But every time I looked at Eleanor's handwriting, that one line, "For Maya," who listened even when I had no words, I felt her standing with me. Not just as someone who left me something, but someone who saw me when no one else did. The judge called for final arguments, and my lawyer, who had stayed steady through the storm, stood and said, "This is not a case about money, it's about memory. It's about honoring someone's wishes when they're no longer here to speak them." And Eleanor Granger spoke, in writing, on camera, with clarity, and with love. The courtroom was silent. Then the judge turned to Sebastian and Claire. He reminded them that the clause was clear. Any challenge to Maya's role would nullify their claim to the estate. Then came the verdict. The codicil was valid. I was awarded full ownership of the vineyard, as well as personal assets specified in Eleanor's amendment. Sebastian and Claire, disinherited, exactly as the clause dictated. They didn't look at me as they left. Claire had tears in her eyes, but not the kind you cry for loss, the kind you cry for losing control. I didn't cheer, I didn't gloat, because even in that moment of victory, I understood the cost. I had lost people, I had lost peace, and I had lost the illusion that family always protects its own. But I had gained something more powerful: truth, recognition, and the chance to preserve something that actually meant something. I walked through the vineyard that same week. The soil was warm, the vines healthy. Eleanor's name still hung on the sign at the gate. But I knew what I wanted to do: not sell it, not cash in, but turn it into a place of rest and creativity, a retreat for writers, thinkers, the overlooked. Just like she would have wanted. Because this story didn't begin in a courtroom, it began in quiet corners, in silent trust, in the unspoken bond between two people who never needed to say much to understand each other. And even though the world had tried to deny that bond, Eleanor made sure it would outlive both of us. That was the real inheritance, and no one could take that away. In the weeks after the ruling, everything felt quiet, not peaceful, not yet. Just quiet, like the air had finally stopped vibrating after a long, painful note. The headlines faded. Sebastian and Claire stopped making statements. They filed one last appeal, but it didn't go anywhere. The judge's decision was airtight, and the clause in Eleanor's will was ironclad. They had lost, and with them went the cold narrative they tried to build about me. But I didn't feel like I had won. Not in the way people imagine. There was no champagne, no celebration. Just the echo of everything I'd carried: grief, exhaustion, disbelief, and now the strange sense of being seen. I spent a lot of time walking the vineyard. Rows and rows of quiet vines, just beginning their bloom. It smelled like sun-warmed earth and hope. And every time I passed through the gates, I heard Eleanor's voice in my head. This place has always been for those who needed room to grow. I didn't want to turn it into a commercial business. That was never my dream. And I knew it wasn't hers either. So I started sketching plans for a retreat, a space for writers, artists, people looking to find their voice again, people like me. The first person I invited was a poet who'd lost her mother. She stayed for 2 weeks and wrote a book of poems under the fig tree near the main house. Then came a screenwriter, fresh off a painful divorce. He left with a pilot script and a little more faith in himself. And little by little, the place started breathing. I didn't speak to Sebastian and Claire again. Not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to say. They weren't villains. They were just people who couldn't imagine love without conditions. And I had finally learned that boundaries weren't cruelty. They were self-respect. What hurt the most was that none of this had to become a battle. Eleanor had tried to do the right thing in her own way, on her own terms. She believed in quiet gestures, in trusting people to do the right thing. But when others failed that test, she made sure I wouldn't be left behind. And I will never forget that. The Vineyard's new name is Claws and Vine, a quiet nod to the line that changed everything. It hangs on a handmade sign at the gate, and every time I walk past it, I smile, because this place isn't about revenge. It's about truth, about reclaiming a space that once felt like it wasn't mine to touch, and now it's home. Some people think inheritance is about wealth. But to me, the real inheritance was the belief Eleanor placed in me when no one else did. She saw something in me that I hadn't even seen in myself, and she gave me the chance to build something that outlasts money. I don't need validation from headlines or lawyers anymore, because I have something stronger. Roots. And every day they grow deeper. They said I had no claim, that I didn't matter, that I was just a girl from the first marriage, barely a footnote in Eleanor's legacy. But they were wrong. Not because I shouted the loudest, not because I had power or influence or money, but because I held onto something stronger than all of that. The truth that Eleanor saw, me, the truth that love doesn't need to be loud to be real, and the truth that even the quiet ones deserve to be heard. What started as a humiliating dismissal turned into something so much more than a legal victory. It became a restoration of my voice, of Eleanor's wishes, and of a bond that never needed to be justified. I didn't just win a vineyard. I inherited courage, a second chance to rewrite the story of who I was and where I belonged. And I used that chance to build something meaningful, something lasting. Something rooted in care, not entitlement. So if you've ever been told that you don't count, that your presence is inconvenient, that your role doesn't matter, I want you to remember this. You don't need permission to take up space in the truth. You don't need validation from those who never tried to understand you. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is quietly refuse to disappear. And when someone tries to write you out of the story, don't be afraid to turn the page. Look for the drawer with no handle. Ask the questions no one wants to answer. And if the world tells you there's no place for you, build one anyway. That's what I did. And that's why this isn't the end. It's the beginning of something better for me, and maybe for someone like you too. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever been the outsider, the overlooked, the underestimated, share your story in the comments. Because sometimes the people who've been silenced the longest are the ones with the most powerful truths to tell. And someone out there might be waiting to hear yours, just like I once was.